Hello, big-scale economics and politics today. Later on, we're going to be hearing tales of two monarchies. One of them's constitutional. The other is the Saudi kingdom. Princes sitting atop a country of 26 million people, rich with oil, but nervously looking around the rest of the Arab world as the wave of protest in Egypt, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Bahrain ripples towards Riyadh. Badawi al-Rashid, viewed by the regime as a dissident, has written its history. The constitutional monarchy is our own one, whose huge success will be much discussed ahead of the royal wedding and next year's Diamond Jubilee. Peter Whittle is an unabashed champion who's calling upon intellectuals to join the cheering. Before that, though, world-sized politics in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. Are China, India and Brazil poised to swipe world leadership away from the West? George Magnus of the investment bank UBS was a rare man in his world in predicting the size of the crash to come, and he is sceptical about the rise of the BRICS. What, though, of Neil Ferguson, the historian whose latest book and series is called simply Civilization, the West and the Rest, and describes the 6 big advantages, or as he puts it, killer apps developed by Europe and America. But he concludes on an elegiac warning note about our own loss of faith in our history and our values. Neil, it seems to me that you see this as a very important potential turning point in world history right now, and it's about self-confidence.
I'm pretty sure it is a turning point. We've had a roughly 500-year period when the big story, not just in economic history but in political history, was the rise of the Western world to a position of dominance over the rest, including the great populous countries of Asia. And I think we're living through the end of that half-millennium of Western ascendancy. Now, that's partly because they finally got it about the Industrial Revolution. In other words, China and other Asian countries have achieved rapid growth after half a millennium of stagnation. But I think it's also partly because things are going wrong in the West, in Europe and in North America. And in some ways I'm more concerned about that loss of self-belief, which is, I think, part and parcel of decline. It's not a simple declinist story. I'm not saying a la Oswald Spengler, you know, the end is nigh, because one of the points I try to make in the book is that decline isn't one of those gradual things. You don't sort of slide gently downhill. Sometimes you can collapse quite suddenly. And it's understanding the roots of collapse, what makes a society vulnerable to a sudden breakdown. That's what really motivates me.
I'd like to come back to what might cause a collapse or not in a moment, but let's just go through the crucial part, the 6 killer apps, as it were. Competition, which we sort of understand because it starts with national competition.
Right.
And a huge number of states in Europe.
Having a very, very fragmented polity was certainly part of Europe's advantage as compared with Asia, where there was one very large polity, the Chinese Empire, ruled by the Ming dynasty in the period that I'm interested in, the period after around 1400, when the West begins to take off. That competition between states could have been, and sometimes was, dysfunctional, but constant war and competition for control of trade routes did promote innovation. Also, there was competition within European societies. And one of the interesting points I try to emphasize is that medieval England was characteristic in that way. It had, for example, a more or less semi-autonomous corporation, the City of London, over which the Crown had very little control. And that's part of the competition that makes Europe more innovative than the East.
And this can go alongside democracy, as it were, in a way, because it allowed Western countries to correct themselves when they made mistakes, to steal ideas from other people, but also some system of self-correction and balance, which the larger, more monoglots or societies didn't have. I'm
very leery of making democracy one of my killer apps. By the way, sorry if you hate the phrase killer apps. It was a way of getting my teenage children interested in my argument. We could call them, if we were feeling more middle-aged, complexes of institutions and ideas.
Much prefer that.
But democracy isn't really one. I mean, lots of people experiment with universal suffrage in the modern period, and it works in some places and not in others. For me, the interesting thing about this story of competition is that you get competition over trade. That really drives the great economic expansion of Europe. You get competition over science, which produces the scientific revolution, and you get competition over legal systems. And for me, the rule of law is more important than democracy per se. It's more important how you in a sense, keep politicians under legal control than how you elect them or or choose them. And so the rule of law is killer app number 3, and in some ways I think it's pretty clear that the system of law that emerged in the English-speaking world had all kinds of advantages over alternative systems of law, such as, for example, Sharia, which I suspect we'll be talking about later. So that's 3 out of 6. The others are medicine, which roughly doubles life expectancy, the consumer society, and the work ethic. And those 6 things together, I think, explain why the West does so well for 500 years.
And one of the interesting arguments about the work ethic, you talked about Spengler, but there's also the great arguments about Protestantism and the rise of capitalism, which at least you're a bit sceptical about, because there are areas of the world which have had religion and haven't had the work ethic, and there are other parts of the Protestant world where it seems to me to be more a consumer ethic these days than a work ethic.
Right. I'm very interested in Weber's great hypothesis that there was some kind of link between the rise of capitalism and the Reformation. And that's an argument that often gets caricatured. So in the book I try to give him a break and show why he thought there might be some connection after a trip to the United States, where the connection seemed very obvious between lots and lots of little churches and a very, very dynamic economy. But the critical point that I want to make in that 6th chapter is it's not really a work ethic that you get from the Reformation, it's a word ethic. Because the Reformation's all about literacy. It's all about reading the scripture in the vernacular. And there's really compelling evidence from recent research on, say, Protestant missionaries, that there is a link from spreading literacy to economic success. So it's a slightly different argument from Weber's.
It's a further stage.
Yeah.
So let's return to the here and now. And we have America still producing huge numbers of new ideas and all the technologies, and, people sit on their Apple computers and their iPads and so on. And yet you think there is a danger of this being the moment when we suddenly get one of those accelerating parts of change. And this is caused possibly by America's excessive debt. There is a potential for a sudden and dramatic moment coming.
I think there's no question, and more people begin to accept this argument, that the United States is in an unsustainable fiscal position. I've been warning about this for years, since before the financial crisis, and now we're in a situation where public and private debt together are more than 350% of GDP. That's unprecedented in history, actually.
So far, America can swallow this because it's still got this AAA rating, and everybody says, of course, the Americans are going to be fine in the end. And it requires only something to go wrong for opinion to turn.
Well, it has, of course, become heavily reliant on China, because China's been financing the US deficit for some years now on a self-interested basis. The Chinese have bought lots of US treasuries to keep their currency from appreciating. But if you want to become dependent on your principal strategic rival for financial support, don't expect to be a great power for terribly much longer. I think that's a pretty clear lesson of history.
Are the Chinese not equally dependent on the Americans?
Well, that's what Americans love to say. They need us as much as we need them, Neil. I hear that every time I go to Washington. I actually don't think the Chinese need the Americans as much anymore. One of the things the financial crisis revealed was that China could keep growing without being exclusively reliant on the US consumer.
George Magnus, we're going to be talking about your book and thesis in a moment, but what do you make of that point in particular?
Well, I think it's correct that clearly the Americans are in hock to China, and it's a dependency which they would be well advised to diminish. But I do think in some respects the situation does cross both ways, because of course the Chinese, they have a choice. They don't have to be continuously buying US assets and restraining their currency all the time. And actually, if they were to succumb eventually to a huge appreciation of their currency, the losses would be very, very considerable. The other thing which I think is also unspoken most of the time in terms of the media is Chinese dependency on American technology and on effectively how they rip off technological ideas from companies that basically set up in China to do business. Not just American, but European companies too. And it is actually something that American and European companies feel really passionate about, much more so than the exchange rate issue, which is often in the newspapers. But that's an issue which I think China does have.
What makes this turning point interesting, George, though, is that at the same time, the Chinese are shifting very rapidly from a sort of piracy model, intellectual property rights, which they basically steal through copying, to a model in which they build their own intellectual property rights. The degree to which they are investing in innovation is really impressive. For example, they will overtake Germany very, very soon in terms of numbers of patents granted each year. And that's something that, when I told a bunch of German industrialists, completely staggered them. They couldn't imagine being overtaken by China, but it's about to happen.
It is, but the point is, Neil, isn't it about cited patents? I mean, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that, quantity rules in China, and there are huge numbers of scientists and engineers being churned out of universities, and lots of articles and so on and so forth. But actually, I think, as far as cited patents are concerned, and the real technological added value, Monday morning, I think there China still has a lot to prove, in my view.
Madawi.
Well, the interesting thing about this debate between the West and China is you see it from the perspective of the Middle East. And what I have noticed over the last 10 years is that the West, with its military power, the scientific killer app that Neil talks about, is actually moving ahead and clearing the ground for the Chinese to move in Afghanistan, in Iraq. And this is something that is not talked about. And you see it and you feel it in the Middle East. So in a way, the dirty work is done by the West for China to move in.
It's very
interesting.
interesting.
That's a hugely important point. I've heard so many people on the left say, oh, the war in Iraq was all about oil, to which I reply, if that's so, why is it that the Chinese, rather than the Americans, are taking over the Iraqi oil assets? And that's part of a broader picture in which the Chinese free ride on very expensive American security, and yet the Chinese actually get much more oil from the Middle East than the Americans. It's a profound paradox of our time, and one of the reasons I think talking about American decline is not illegitimate.
Peter Whittle.
When you talk about American decline, Neil, I'm interested in what you say about this loss of faith generally of the West. It seems to me that there is a difference between America and Europe here. I wonder whether you agree with this, because, yes, sure, in Europe it's more than, I'd say, a loss of faith. It's an outright sort of self-loathing which has taken over. But I don't detect this in America. I don't detect a loss of faith in America. And isn't America the most important player?
I think the trouble is that Americans have a tendency to have faith in symbols rather than in the real foundations of their power. Let me illustrate this with a simple example. The most important language, the most international language in the world is not English, it's mathematics. But if you look at attainment at age 14 in the field of mathematics, the Asians are now miles ahead of Americans and Europeans alike. So when I say we've lost faith in our institutions, I'm not really talking about the stars and stripes. I'm talking about the fact that we've lost faith in the real mainsprings of our power.
We've got soft.
I think we have, and I think it's there in the schools, it's there in the universities, and those institutions, of course I'm in education so I would say this, but those institutions are hugely important because they transmit our culture from generation to generation, and I genuinely believe they have got a lot worse at doing that over the years.
George Magnus, let's turn to your book Uprising, Will Emerging Markets Shape or Shake the World Economy, which is a quite a beady look at the case that China, India, Brazil and others will rise into the ascendancy as a result partly of the world crash. And you seem to be a little more sceptical than Neil.
Sceptical, I mean, I should say straight off, I subscribe completely to Neil's assessment of, why are we making such a mess of our own kind of existential issues in the West. I mean, I don't think much of that is actually in contention. But I think it's just too easy just to think that the last 25 years of astounding success, which, for example, China has achieved, can be drawn in a straight line into the future. And I think that a lot of what China did in the last 20 years, for example, was based around the introduction of market mechanisms. Deng Xiaoping once said to a Communist Party Congress, I don't care if it's a black cat or a white cat, so long as it's a cat that catches mice. And that was widely attributed to mean that, we communists, but actually we don't have to have Marxism as our kind of lodestone. And of course what happened after that, land reform, giving farmers rights, giving people economic rights, the largest privatization of home ownership ever recorded in history, reform of these cumbersome state-owned enterprises. These are the bedrock of China's success to date. But I think that the crisis has changed everything. What the Chinese call the North Atlantic crisis, I think, has changed everything because the way the world works has changed. So these export markets on which China and many of the other developing and emerging countries depend clearly will not be the same again. And and I think this is going to give rise, apart from the kind of geopolitical tensions between the US and China, I think this is giving rise to domestic tensions in China, which are going to become more and more important as they get richer.
Because remind us, China needs